Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, May 13th. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced his cabinet in Ottawa today. The swearing-in ceremony took place in Rideau Hall at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time.
The Honourable Mélanie Joly, Minister of Industry, Minister responsible for Canada Economic Development for the Quebec region.
Moi, Mélanie Joly, je promets et déclare solennellement et sincèrement qu'au mieux de ma compétence et de ma connaissance, j'exécuterai loyalement et fidèlement les pouvoirs et je m'acquitterai des responsabilités qui m'ont été confiées en qualité de ministre de l'Industrie et ministre responsable du Développement économique Canada pour les régions du Québec. I, Mélanie Joly, do solemnly and sincerely promise and declare that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister of Industry and Minister responsible for Canada Economic Development for Quebec regions. That's good. Thank you.
Mr. Carney has committed to gender equality in his cabinet, a standard established by Mr. Trudeau when he took office in 2015. Parliament is slated to return on May 26th, and Mr. Carney has announced that King Charles III will deliver the speech from the throne the next day. Joining us now is Liberal strategist Andrew Perez. Andrew, thanks for being back with us today.
Good to be here.
Now, what do you make of Carney's cabinet being much smaller than it was under Trudeau's years?
I think it's unsurprising, and the cabinet that's been unveiled today really demonstrates, Teresa, that this is a new government, and the ministers are made to measure to really confront the challenges that we face. Carney has been clear that he received a mandate from the Canadian people to forge a new economic and security relationship with the United States, to tackle the high cost of living and to make this country more affordable for everyday Canadians, and to move forward with building new housing, doubling the rate of residential housing construction in this country, and to combat crime, which has become an issue across the country. And so when you look at the portfolios and the injection of significant new blood into this cabinet, I really do think it aligns well with the challenges that we face, and also changing the structure of the cabinet, making the cabinet not only more lean, but having 28 ministers who are heading up major portfolios, but then also having 10 secretaries of state, junior level ministers with a specific focus. We haven't had a secretary of state model in the cabinet since the Jean Chrétien years. So I think the structure of the cabinet is made for the moment, and I think there's significant new blood. When you add up both the junior ministers and the senior ministers, you have a ministry of 38 ministers, 24 of whom are new, either newly elected members of parliament or members of the backbench. And so I think that's very encouraging.
But is a smaller cabinet necessarily a good thing? Some critics right now are arguing that this ultimately puts too much on a minister's plate.
Well, that's why we have these secretaries of state. The main cabinet is smaller. It's 28 members, so about 10 members smaller than the Trudeau cabinet. But we have these ministers of state with special responsibility. One thing that I found very interesting, Ruby Sahota, a longtime Brampton MP, has been appointed as a secretary of state with special emphasis on combating crime. And so I think that's an example of the Liberal Party, even though the party has been in power for 10 years and there's been a concern around crime, has really taken that issue seriously, listened to the electorate, and appointed a minister with special responsibility for that file. And so I think what you'll see is ministers that are responsible and are given a lot of autonomy. Mr. Carney has already spoken about the need to bring back traditional cabinet government. That is to say, a style of government where senior ministers have real autonomy and influence. Mr. Carney is not going to micromanage this cabinet. Certainly, his focus will be the major economic files relating to global trade and the US-Canada relationship. And he will expect his senior ministers to carry the day on their file to really have their own sphere of influence. And so I think that this is healthy. We're going to see a form of government where cabinet ministers have more influence.
And who are some of the new faces in cabinet and what are their roles? And what is the significance of having 7 new faces in cabinet?
Well, this is, I would say, the most pro-growth cabinet that we've had in over a decade. You have newcomers like Tim Hodgson, who is a very successful businessman who worked with Mark Carney at the Bank of Canada, take over the natural resources and energy file. So Mr. Hodgson is going to be overseeing the building of new infrastructure projects, west-east pipelines. You have 3 notable Indigenous leaders from ridings in northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, and northern Quebec take on key portfolios. You have an Indigenous leader, Mandy Gull-Masti, the first Indigenous Canadian to actually oversee the Ministry of Indigenous Services. You have Gregor Robertson, who was the mayor of Vancouver for a decade, very well regarded, especially in progressive circles, take on the important role of housing and infrastructure. And so I think what you see with this cabinet, Teresa, is balancing veterans with newcomers. Obviously, the experience that the veterans have will be critical to stick handle the challenges we face, but also injecting that new blood to bring new perspectives to bear in what is a new government.
Now, you did mention housing. So, housing critics saw Nathaniel Erskine Smith as a solid MP to keep the housing portfolio and are pretty upset that he's been removed from the post. What do you make of that decision?
Mr. Erskine Smith was certainly well regarded in the housing sector, and ultimately his time in the ministry was short lived. But ultimately these are decisions made by a prime minister, and Gregor Robertson, as a mayor of a major Canadian city for a decade, I think brings valuable experience to the housing portfolio. And so I'm hopeful that under his leadership, the government will be able to begin meeting its commitments. Carney has committed to doubling the rate of housing construction in this country, and that is going to be a major task.
Now, there was a little bit of buzz last night with some reports saying that Chrystia Freeland would not be in cabinet. But as we saw today, she did end up keeping a role. Given how important she was for the Trudeau government, is having Freeland in cabinet a positive or a negative?
I think keeping Miss Freeland is a positive. At the end of the day, she's held so many senior posts in this government. She brings so much experience. And the post that she's in right now, transport and internal trade, while critical, is a domestic file. She's not going to be interacting with the Trump administration in any shape or form. And I think she'll bring a great deal of experience. Remember, Carney is committed to eliminating internal trade barriers by July 1st. And Ms. Freeland will be stick handling that and ensuring that that commitment is made and carried out on time. And so I think it's an encouraging post. I'm glad that she's still on the team.
And you mentioned that Freeland won't be dealing with the Trump administration, or at least not too much. But what about Donald Trump's comments about Freeland? Does Freeland in cabinet potentially cause a rift between Carney and Trump, even though she's not necessarily dealing with that administration?
I don't think so, Teresa. At the end of the day, she has a domestic role in this cabinet. She will not be interacting with Trump or any officials in the Trump administration in any shape or form. And that's just a reality. And so I don't think it's going to be a distraction at all. And I think the country will benefit from the experience that she brings with over a decade of experience in a variety of senior portfolios in the former government.
Now, we do just have about a minute left, but how do you view this cabinet governing differently than under the Trudeau years?
It's a more focused cabinet, and one where you have a variety of very highly accomplished individuals from a variety of sectors, whether it be the indigenous community, the business community, individuals who have served as senior cabinet ministers, finance ministers in provincial governments, a former mayor of the third largest city in the country. And so I think it's a cabinet that's really zeroing in on the economy. When you have business titans like Tim Hodgson, who has served on the most senior boards of directors in this country, now heading up energy and natural resources, I think that's very promising. So I think Mr. Carney is going to run his government like a business, and this cabinet is going to be like a board of directors. And I'll be very eager to see the progress that they're able to make in the coming 6 months as we look ahead to the fall and really grappling with the Trump administration.
Andrew, thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks for your time.
Stay with us. We'll have more news from across Canada and around the world right after the break. Donald Trump has touched down in Saudi Arabia. The U.S. president is kicking off his 4-day Mideast trip by paying a visit to Saudi's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The two leaders held talks on U.S. efforts to dismantle Iran's nuclear program and end the war in Gaza. And later today, Mr. Trump is slated to take part in a U.S.-Saudi investment conference and have a formal dinner with the Crown Prince. Our correspondent Wyatt Sharp has more on Donald Trump's trip to the Middle East.
President Trump is making his first state visit of his second term to the Middle East, a fairly atypical destination, certainly for the first state visit. He's going to be visiting 3 countries, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, as well as Saudi Arabia. And it comes as these countries have really been key kind of third parties in trying to help the United States negotiate with the likes of Russia and Ukraine to put an end to the conflict that's been going on there. Of course, ever since February of 2022, it's went beyond that as well, but that's kind of when the conflict was first kind of escalated. That's one component of this. And then in the media, of course, domestically in the United States and in Canada in recent days, you've been seeing a lot about the $400 million luxury jet that Qatar is going to be gifting Donald Trump. It's been getting a lot of headlines, a lot of media discussion, certainly here in Canada, but also in the United States. Donald Trump making that visit to Qatar again at a time when Qatar has been, a little bit more friendly towards the United States under Donald Trump than previous presidents. Certainly, they were not too complimentary towards the likes of Joe Biden, even to Donald Trump in his first term. And so a lot of things that we're going to be watching. Of course, these countries also interesting. They haven't been hit as hard by some of the tariffs, as much as countries like Canada or Mexico or even China, of course, have been. And so the fact that we're kind of at this moment right now where the United States has better relations, it seems, with countries in the Middle East that don't have a history of kind of upholding democratic rights is certainly something that Democrats have been talking about over the course of the past few weeks as to reasons why, we should really try and promote a certain level of democratic engagement within Canada.
China is moving to strengthen its alliance as a counterweight to Donald Trump's trade war. President Xi Jinping says he's ready to join hands with Latin American countries to block protectionism a day after China and the U.S. agreed to a 90-day truce in their tariff stalemate. The realities of Mr. Trump's global trade offensive overshadowed an initial burst of optimism over the China-U.S. deal among investors, as rallies in stocks and oil prices faded. Concordia University's Dr. Moshe Lander joined us for more on the ongoing trade war and the 90-day truce between the U.S. and China.
The 90-day truce is better than no truce at all, but I think it's all a matter of perspective. If you're comparing it to where we were 6 months ago, there were no tariffs. So even this 90-day truce still means that there are tariffs in place, and that's worse than where we were, but it's better than where we were a week ago. So I think that this is going to save the Chinese and American economies from an economic slowdown, whether that's a recession or whether that's just slower than normal growth. But for anybody who thinks that this is going to return things to the way they were, they're sadly mistaken. And all it continues to do is distort trade patterns from what they were, what they should be. And of course, the other part of it too is that it's all in this name of Trump seeing trade as a zero-sum game. So it's not a free trade agreement. It's not anything that's going to allow consumers and businesses to choose what they want to do with their money and with their investments. And so in that sense, it's still very, very dangerous. I think that consumers and businesses feel a little more confident today than they did last week. But that's not to say that they should feel overwhelmingly confident that this is going to come back in 90 days, or that it's going to come back more aggressively, or that there's going to have to be some grand bargain to eliminate this extra level of uncertainty that while there's no tariffs right now, or at least no 145% tariffs, that's not to say that they could come back. We've seen Trump before do a 180 and then double down when he realizes that there's trouble.
Dr. Lander also unpacked if the truce will help delay or postpone a potential tariff-related recession in the U.S.
So, I think the thing with the recession is that it's such a technical definition, 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, that I don't know if it necessarily saves them from a recession, but it's not going to save them from a slowdown. Let's put it in perspective. Let's say that the Chinese economy is growing at about 5-6% per year, and they slow down as a result 3 percentage points to 2 or 3%. If the US economy is growing at 2% a year and they slow down 2 to 3 percentage points per year, that's now flat to negative growth. So are we going to say that the US is having a recession, but China avoided one? They both experienced the same economic slowdown. So I think that's much more important is what could you have been growing at and what are you growing at now? It's less than you would have been in the absence of these tariffs. So that to me is the real damage, whether it meets the NBER technical definition of the 2 declining quarters of GDP. It's almost irrelevant. When the job losses mount, when consumers are spending less, when businesses are canceling major investment projects because of the uncertainty, that's really all that matters from my standpoint. And I think that that's really the damaging part of the story.
Lastly, Dr. Lander touched on how large of a trading partner China is with the U.S., and if there is a scenario where either of them could function economically without the other.
They are completely codependent. And so we could say that this is the loveless marriage. They don't like each other. They really would prefer to be away from each other, but they can't go it alone. Don't forget that the flip side of the trade story is the financial part of the story, and they do go hand in hand. If the US has a trade deficit with China, which they do, that also means that China will own a tremendous amount of American assets, the headline being US government bonds. So in effect, for the US government to finance its huge debt, it's China that's paying for it. And so if the US wants to try and undo its trade deficit with China, it's also going to have to undo its debt to China. And so you can imagine that the US president would say, well, I want to undo that debt. Fine. Who else is going to take it on? Which investor is going to step up and say, I'm willing to buy up $1 trillion worth of your bonds and help finance your consistent overspending? The US likes the idea of its low taxes. That's great, but you're going to have to borrow then from the rest of the world. And I don't know that there's a lot of countries with the size and heft that are out there to be able to do that. Maybe the reason he's in the Middle East right now is beyond accepting a free jet from Qatar is that he's looking to say, hey, you have a lot of money. Maybe I'd rather be codependent with you. The flip side of it as well is from China's standpoint, the US is a major market for its exports, but it also is a vehicle for all of that Chinese saving to find a safe harbor for its investment opportunities. And so where China could go around the world and invest in other countries, the other countries are seen to be riskier than the US, at least traditionally. And so if you want to be the exporter to the world, you also need a place to park your money. So it would be really difficult for them to unwind from each other, and it would be almost impossible for them to find somebody else to take their place. Remember that the two of them combined make up, give or take, around 40% of the global economy. There's just not enough countries out there with enough size to make up for that.
And President Trump says he'll set a 30-day deadline for drug makers to lower the cost of prescription drugs. If a deal is not reached, a new rule will tie the price of what the U.S. pays for medications to lower prices paid by other countries.
I think you're going to see a tremendous cut. I don't think. I mean, I know you're going to see it in Medicaid and Medicare. That cut will be massive because drugs are 50-60% of the cost. So Medicaid costs are going down and Medicare costs are going down because of what we're doing today. And there's no, it's not like, oh, gee, well, maybe it won't happen. It's going to happen because the other countries have no choice. Now, the drug companies are going to have to say, listen, if you don't pay more, we're not going to give you the drug, and they're willing to do that. So that's it. They have to, we have to equalize.
Mr. President, what is Mr. price controls?
Say it?
How do you respond to the fact that this...
It's not price control. No, no. What was price control is before. If you want to talk about price control is what they were doing. They were making us pay. They set a price, and they said, here's what we're going to pay, and anything else charge America. Because at that time they had a very stupid president, and it really went crazy during the last 4 years. And remember this, the Democrats are the ones that allowed this to happen. They were the ones that were the protector of this pricing system. And I think it's going to be very hard. You'll have to ask Democrats, are they going to vote against the one great, big, beautiful deal that's being negotiated now, tax cuts, etc., when now on top of the tax cuts and regulation cuts, all the things, now you're going to say that the price of your medicine is going down by 60, 70, 80%. You're going to vote against it? I think a lot of Democrats are going to be forced to do something that their leaders are going to beg them not to do.
The U.S. government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on prescription drugs, injectables, transfusions, and other medications for nearly 70 million older Americans every year. Yesterday, a coalition of climate activists were in the Parliamentary Press Gallery calling on the new Carney government to commit to phasing out fossil fuels in Canada.
Today, we stand united in calling on the newly elected federal government to sign on to and implement the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Under this treaty, Canada would have a legal obligation to stop all new fossil fuel projects, to wind down the existing production of fossil fuels, and to do so in a manner that doesn't leave communities or workers behind. We are making this call today, one day after Mother's Day, in the wake of the Pilgrimage for the Planet, a pilgrimage from Montreal in which people from all sorts of backgrounds, faith and non-faith, joined together to cycle here to the national capital to show solidarity with each other, with those most affected by the climate crisis, with all of creation, and to make this urgent call. This morning, the pilgrims gathered with a crowd of about 100 people on Parliament Hill. I believe they're still there. And for a demonstration that was co-sponsored by Fridays for Future Ottawa, Cafes Ottawa, Kairos Canada, the Mouvement Laudato Si movement, ORSI, and the Oblate Centre. These people are gathered there out of a deep concern for the current state of climate policy in Canada. While the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement was important and monumental, it failed to mention oil, coal, or gas, despite 86% of climate change causing carbon emissions coming from the burning of fossil fuels.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says her government is freezing its industrial carbon price effective immediately at $95 per ton of emissions.
That's why today we're announcing that effective immediately, Alberta is freezing the industrial carbon tax under Alberta's Technology and Innovation Emissions Reduction System, or TIER, at $95 per ton of emissions. This price was set to increase to $110 per ton next year and continue increasing to $170 per ton by 2030. Now, let me be clear, Alberta remains committed to reducing emissions through the development and implementation of new technologies, not unrealistically high taxes, while responsibly powering the world for decades to come. Alberta's industrial carbon tax system, TIER, has been in place since 2007. Our approach has reduced emissions in intensity by over 22% and reduced overall emissions by an estimated 7.2%, while production increased by 90%. We have a reasonable system in place that's working, but any additional increases past $100 per ton will wipe out any of the benefits we've seen. That means fewer jobs for Albertans, less revenue to invest in our public services, and decreased innovation across our industries. But instead of supporting our industry, Ottawa wants to increase their industrial carbon tax to $170 per ton by 2030.
The price had been set to rise to $110 per ton in 2026 and to continue increasing to $170 per ton by 2030. Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz says going over $100 a ton would make the province wildly uncompetitive.
Over the past months, we have been engaging with industry on the future of our TIER program. We know that regulation is up in 2026, and we wanted to hear how industry felt about what's working well and what presents a challenge. Certainly, concerns were raised about the impacts of a carbon price reaching over $100 per ton. That is why, effective immediately, we're freezing the industrial carbon price. This will provide a stable, predictable, and effective environment for companies to operate and remain competitive. It will also benefit sectors across the economy, including agriculture, forestry, and manufacturing, helping reduce costs, grow industries, and of course, keep Albertans working. We're keeping Alberta competitive, standing up for our workers, our industries, and our economy. We are absolutely a leader when it comes to energy and resource development, but also when it comes to emissions reduction. This is our jurisdiction, not Ottawa's. And if the federal government wants to work together to keep our economy strong, respect the Constitution, and do the right thing for the environment, they can follow the path forward that has been outlined by the Premier over the last couple of weeks.
The National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations is calling Alberta's separatism talk irresponsible. At a news conference to outline the priorities for the return to Parliament, Nova Scotia Senator Paul Prosper and Chief Sidney Woodhouse-Nepinak spoke on Alberta's separatism.
With respect to the Premier's proposal, it's certainly within her domain to exercise what she sees fit with respect to what is in the best interests of her province, her territory. But independent of that, there has to be a recognition as a precondition of the existing rights that, as National Chief has said, that that existed before the founding of this country. These are constitutional rights that can't be just overridden, for sake of a political stance. They must be taken into account, and they must involve the Indigenous people within certainly that province.
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely. Look, I'm going to quote a friend of mine, Chief Cody Thomas from the Enoch Cree, just outside of Edmonton, and I talked to him this weekend. And he said, the notion of Alberta unilaterally separating from Canada is not only unconstitutional, it's a direct affront to the sacred treaties that predate the province itself. First Nations have never ceded our inherent rights to these lands and these resources. Any attempt by separatists to disregard these treaties would undermine the very foundation of this country. So, we'll be, standing firm. First Nations are standing firm on any discussion on separation. And, we have treaties that were foundational to this country. Alberta didn't even exist when those were signed and created to create this beautiful place.
Chief Nepinak says that it's not smart for politicians to make statements about it without consulting First Nations first. On a different matter, Chief Nepinak also said that parliamentarians will be playing games with First Nations children's lives if they fail to quickly introduce and pass legislation to ensure access to clean drinking water. She added that every member of Parliament in Canada has the obligation to think about all the children of this country.
There's lots to talk on the water bill, on the water legislation. And I think every member of Parliament, and I'll be writing this, I think, in my letter to each of them. I haven't wrote them all letters yet, but I will be. We're just waiting for all of them to be swearing in, and we'll be sending them out letters of congratulations and talking to them about our priorities, this being one of the number one issues. Certainly, though, I think that there was too many political games last Parliament. People were kicking it around, and shame on all the members of Parliament that were delaying and pushing that down and playing games with First Nations, with children's lives. Imagine a little child on a First Nation waiting for, and every member of Parliament in Canada that's going to sit in that house has an obligation to think about all the children of this country. And shame on people that played games, pushing it down, politically ball kicking it to each other and blaming each other, even through the election. so disheartening and just disheartening. And I just thought, you all had an obligation. You all had the chance to support that, and some people didn't when they had the chance.
Chief Nepinak says she will hold Prime Minister Carney to his promise to reintroduce the legislation known as Bill C-61. And Chief Nepinak is also calling on Prime Minister Carney to invite First Nations to the Team Canada discussions, saying, quote, Canada Strong cannot be successful without the full participation of First Nations people across this beautiful country.
This was at this critical time in this country's history. It is important to recognize Canada's gross domestic product is generated off First Nations lands and resources. Over $560 billion of projects are forecast on our traditional lands over the next decade. The potential benefits are measured in the trillions of dollars. But we won't advance without First Nations support. So we look forward to working with Prime Minister Carney and the next Parliament toward a secure, safe, and prosperous country for First Nations and for all Canadians. We also lift up First Nations candidates from all parties that ran in this election. And as I said, we have more First Nation MPs than ever before. We look forward to working with each of them over the coming 100 days and beyond. As National Chief, I also want to say that we stand with First Nations across this country in strongly condemning the imposition of illegal tariffs by the United States government. The truth is that First Nations have inhabited these territories long before colonial borders were established. These lands hold vast deposits of critical minerals, forests, and fresh water supplies that sustain communities on both sides of the medicine line. And we have 20% of the world's fresh water. That is why we are calling on First Nations and First Ministers, to fully include First Nations in the Team Canada discussions. That hasn't happened to date. Keeping First Nations out of crucial conversations impacting our treaty rights is no longer acceptable. And they've done this to previous national chiefs over and over and over again. And to the provinces and to the federal government, it's time to, in 2025, it's not Team Canada and it's not Canada Strong without treaty rights holders at the table.
British Columbia has shortened the time for American nurses to register to work in the province from months to a few days. The province is launching a targeted U.S. marketing campaign in June to bring more nurses north.
What I am going to speak to about, though, is something a little bit different. It's about how we get the doctors and nurses to be able to staff places like this, hospitals and healthcare sites across the province. And one of the big opportunities that we've seen is recruiting health professionals from the United States. The uncertainty that's currently present in the United States related to the Trump administration presents a significant opportunity for British Columbia in an array of areas to recruit Americans, but particularly in the healthcare sector. We believe that by recruiting American healthcare workers into our system, they're able to hit the ground running with their experience in a system that's very similar to ours, and they'll help us in our goal of delivering more care to more British Columbians faster. Now, some of the factors that are driving increased interest in British Columbia that we're seeing include, we believe, our commitment and our support for science and the evidence that science directs us to around everything from healthcare to climate change. That we are a jurisdiction that respects reproductive rights and acts to protect reproductive rights for British Columbians. And that we take care of people regardless of how much money they have through our universal public healthcare system. So these are proud and competitive advantages for us, and it is driving interest from American healthcare professionals.
Premier David Eby says since launching its new process for U.S. nurses in early April, 177 people have applied to work in BC, and 113 have received their registrations to practice. When taking questions from reporters, Mr. Eby was asked how many Americans have been hired to work so far in Canada's healthcare system, and if there are any concerns in regards to salary matching.
We'll have to get you those specific numbers, Richard, on the number of Americans in the system. The numbers that we have are for people who have applied to be able to practice here since the big changes in April, which I've indicated are up 127% over previous numbers. The overall interest that we're seeing from Americans coming to practice in British Columbia is the ability to practice a universal healthcare system, the ability to match lifestyle that they're looking for in more rural communities, often an outdoor lifestyle. When I was in Grand Forks, one of the big attractors for healthcare workers to come to work in Grand Forks was mountain biking, for example, and skiing and other types of lifestyle attractions here in British Columbia. And so what we're seeing is Americans making that decision about how to balance the life that they want to live and where they want to live with the work that they do and the impact they have in community. And for many Americans, the balance is coming up that they want to move to British Columbia.
Ontario will remove tolls from the public portions of Highway 407. The Ford government has confirmed and is delivering on an election promise made in February, but stopping short of demands from many groups to work on buying back the entire toll route. Today, the province announced that it would remove the tolls from Highway 407 East, which runs through Durham region from Brock Road to Highway 35, beginning on June 1st.
We're here next to the 407 East in Durham, which is the largest stretch of provincially owned tolled highway in Ontario. Today, I'm pleased to announce that starting June the 1st, 2025, tolls from Brock Road to Highway 35, 115 are coming off the 407. Okay. That means that just in a few short weeks, once the legislation is passed, there'll not be one single publicly owned tolled highway left in Ontario. And that's thanks to our government's ban on new road tolls in the province. There will never, ever be a road toll in Ontario again. This change will save daily commuters up to $7,200 every single year.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi said on Monday in his first public comments since the U.S. brokered ceasefire over the weekend that India has only paused its military action and will retaliate on its own terms if there is any future terror attacks on the country. Tensions are rising between the two nuclear-armed rivals after a deadly attack on tourists in Kashmir, raising fears for regional peace. India blamed Pakistan for supporting the militants behind the attack, but Pakistan denied the accusation. Prime Minister Modi spoke after both Indian and Pakistani officials confirmed that there was no firing reported overnight along a border between the two countries. Yesterday, in what is largely seen as a drastic reversal in both policy and tone, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that his government will begin to crack down on immigration, saying that his country is becoming an island of strangers.
Let me put it this way. Nations depend on rules, fair rules. Sometimes they're written down, often they're not. But either way, they give shape to our values, guide us towards our rights, of course, but also our responsibilities, the obligations we owe to each other. Now, in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Without them, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together. So when you have an immigration system that seems almost designed to permit abuse, that encourages some businesses to bring in lower paid workers rather than invest in our young people, or simply one that is sold by politicians to the British people on an entirely false premise, then you're not championing growth, you're not championing justice, or however else people defend the status quo. You're actually contributing to the forces that are slowly pulling our country apart. So yes, I believe in this. I believe we need to reduce immigration significantly. That's why some of the policies in this white paper go back nearly 3 years. Why I told the Labour Party conference, taking back control is a Labour argument. And why, most importantly of all, inward migration is already falling with this government.
The high-profile federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs entered its second day today in Lower Manhattan, where the 55-year-old music mogul faces charges including racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Mr. Combs, who was arrested last September, has pleaded not guilty and denied all allegations. On Monday, a jury of 8 men and 4 women heard opening statements and testimony from the first 2 witnesses called to the stand by the government. After 23 years of NBA absence, NBC has announced its coverage will return for next season.
Basketball.
This fall, the NBA is coming home to NBC and streaming on Peacock.
John Test still got it.
But that wasn't the only big news the network had. On Monday, during a presentation at Radio City Music Hall in New York, they announced that Michael Jordan is joining NBC Sports as a special contributor to its NBA coverage when the 2025-2026 season begins. In a pivotal Game 4 matchup, the Edmonton Oilers shut out the Vegas Golden Knights 3-0, taking a commanding 3-1 series lead. Adam Henrique led the charge with 2 goals, but that didn't come without a fight.
Powers it. Hyman from behind the net to Kane. Score! Henrique again, and Hill wants a piece of Evander Kane. This ready to boil. Brief celebration, then more rough stuff. Hill just threw a shot at Hyman. Wants to go with Nurse.
Meanwhile, in Raleigh, the Carolina Hurricanes dominated the Washington Capitals 5-2 to pull ahead in the series 3-1. 12 different Hurricane skaters recorded at least 1 point.
Back out for Gostisbehere, who has a point in each of the last 2 games. Maintains control along the line. Gostisbehere now shoots. Score!
The only game on the NHL playoff slate tonight features the Winnipeg Jets visiting the Dallas Stars for Game 4 of their series. The puck drops at 5 p.m. Pacific time. The Jets will look to even out their series, while the Stars aim to take a commanding 3-1 lead. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on X and TikTok. Good night, Canada.